No More Tears, a very well known strapline for one of the biggest companies in the world that has unfortunately caused plenty of tears for hundreds of thousands of people over decades. That is today's show. You'll know that if you listen to the show live, every month we have low tox partners that help you with your swaps or stock ups, depending on what you might need right now. Check out the Weleda and Oz Climate offers below. These two are for Aussie residents. Enjoy. Gardiner, hello. How are you?
Good, Alex. I'm glad to be here.
I am so excited to be here. Thank you for being a long form investigative journalist by career because I genuinely believe you guys and girls are the most precious thinkers and explorers of these muddy, muddy times. And today we're going to unpack the story of one of the biggest healthcare companies in the world with the most ironic strapline in history, Johnson&Johnson, no more tears. But I'm going to start by asking you, were you always a curious person growing up? Was it like, were you the why kid and the 4-year-old phase never stopped?
I think so. I mean, I think I've always been curious. I think I've always been maybe a little pissed off for reasons that are a little unclear, maybe because my mom died when I was young, or I'm not sure. But yeah, I always was why and then why. That's terrible. Yeah, about a lot of things that we all kind of take for granted, I think. So I spent much of my life kind of peeling the onion, early in my career. I was a police reporter in Louisville and ended up getting the chief of police indicted and fired. Uh, the black bag unit for the department, which was called the intelligence department, ended up surveilling me for a long time, and it became sort of dangerous, which led my editors to send me to Hazard, Kentucky, where I uncovered this broad-ranging conspiracy within the industry to cover up dust records within coal mines, um, and cover up just an enormous amount of dust that's to this day killing coal miners. And in fact, I checked the records for the then sitting governor of Kentucky, a guy named Paul Patton, and discovered that he was part of this thing. And
Whoa.
so I ended up doing a story about accusing the governor of the time of felonies. And he held this big rally in Pikeville, where he's from. There must have been 1,000 people under a tent, and I went to cover it. And he like pointed down to me as he denounced me, and I was honestly not sure I was going to get out of there alive.
I can imagine. Do you in your in your line of work? I can imagine that's happened a few times where you thought, have I gone too far here?
Yeah, happened again and again and again. It happened in, amongst Kashmiri militants on the borders between India and Pakistan. I think back in the day, reporters ended up being more out on their own than they.
Well, I grew up in a time where, I think just the facts, man. And I just think of these like go where no man dares to go kind of situations where reporters were frontline investigators,
Right.
and it was a duty. And it was before the muddying of a huge amount of advertising corrupted a lot of the messaging, or made the messaging have to be dumbed down to please sponsors and all that kind of stuff. It was like you were the truth seekers. And
Yeah.
every major crime that was committed politically, like, I think of Watergate, I think of all these things. And I think, it was reporters that helped us figure all of these things out.
Well, and I think also reporters back then just had so much more freedom to do
Mm,
what they felt was right. There, first of all, there were thousands more outlets, right? Every little town. Like when I was in Hazard, Kentucky, there were three newspapers in
yeah.
Hazard, right?
Wow.
I was working for the Louisville paper, but there were these three small, papers that were all competing in this tiny town of 9,000. And most towns had uh, something of a paper themselves.
Mm,
And so that created a kind of dynamic where it was really hard to control the narrative centrally. And I think one of the unfortunate aspects of the collapse of media over the last 20 years is that we're now down to just sort of a handful of incredibly powerful media organizations. One of them is the New York Times that I work for, and the other one is the Wall Street Journal, part of, the Fox News empire. And and so I think that there's growing suspicion about what's left to people, which are just a very few organizations that really control the landscape in kind of mainstream media. Um,
Mm,
it's why there's been this embrace of this proliferation of, Substacks and, much smaller micro voices to kind of say, wait a second, this is not right. Because I will tell you, my years at the New York Times, the New York Times has an orthodoxy about certain stories, and that orthodoxy can be wrong and has been wrong on numerous occasions. And in that, as we talk about other things, feeds suspicion.
it does. I remember studying media and political science in my degree at uni, and there's that fantastic ground news on Instagram these days, and they show you the left, the center, and the right take. And the headlines, so that you can actually see that anyone
Yeah.
can spin anything a certain way. And I remember back in third year, we had to grade things like that. We were given 7 newspapers. We had no idea where they came from, what they were leaning. They were largely fictitious, and we had to go from left to right into the middle and grade them by one same political incident. And it was one of the best life skills I've ever been given, because you can read, analyze, see through, and assess quite quickly to what there might be as an ulterior motive on something, right? And
Right.
so it's really important, I think, to rebuild these skills for everybody in this landscape where you now have very controlled messaging, both left and right. I mean,
Right.
here in Australia, we have a joke that, oh, what does Rupert Murdoch want us to vote this year?
Right.
Because
Right.
he owns so much of the media landscape and it's so obvious. Um, and I guess the problem is yes, humans crave multi-perspective. I don't see my perspective anywhere. I want to find it. And so now you can. But I kind of want investigative journalists to go out and do all that stuff rather than
Right.
random bro podcasters that the whole world ends up believing is a god. Like, that's not great either.
No, there's no good answer. I mean, Alex, one of the problems that, I'm sorry to look down, but I decided to open up the New York Times app, which is how we all sort of read newspapers nowadays.
Yeah, yeah,
If
I got mine too.
And if you go, these are all stories, all stories, and then you go and it says opinion. You can't really
Mm,
see that. And then there are all these op-eds, opinion
mm,
pieces. Now, when you're scrolling through, it one looks very much like the other. In the old days, you could only read the newspaper by opening up the paper, and the front page was all news. And if you
mm,
wanted to get to opinion, you had to page to the back to a special section that was just opinion. And it was clear that it was sort of set off. Now, many readers, according to reader surveys back in the day, still kind of confused them. But now it's all one feed. And
mm.
you have these stories and you have opinions, and it's all part of the same thing. And so I think it has led, and by the way, the opinion pieces often end up being the most read, because when someone is shouting about their opinion, the writing itself can feel very compelling, as
Mm.
opposed to a he said, she said dynamic on a news story. So,
Yeah, well, we prefer storytelling than we do just
but
fact listing.
uh, so the sort of the pivot of journalism to the online space has really heightened individual voices, not just writ large, as we see, everybody's got a Facebook page and has their own opinions, but also within these top media organizations. You look at the feed on your phone, and the opinion pieces and the news pieces look all the same.
Hmm. And so, do you feel like it would be actually a really good step to for people to disclose whether it's an opinion or not? Like a lot of people don't know that Fox News is an entertainment company. They're not a news company, for example. And people are shocked when I say, I'm like, did you know? It is one giant opinion piece there, and I think we need to learn how to distinguish that. But I feel like we've been bombarded so much, Gardner, that like people now get their news from a headline. We're in this dopamine addiction phase
Yeah,
of
100%.
learning where
Yeah.
it's top line, top line, top line. I don't got time. Plus, the bigger picture of that, I think, is people are stressed more than they ever have been before. We've eroded the middle class pretty much. And people are working harder, working longer, trying to make it all work. Like the whole thing, you can see how we end up then just quickly grabbing things in all parts of our lives. And that does us a massive disservice.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, it makes me crazy. It's got to make
Mm,
everybody else crazy too. I mean, one of the great challenges of doing those jobs, I think, like, I don't understand really how reporters even do their jobs now because you, you're supposed to go out and talk to real people. On the other hand, you have 7 or 8 different electronic communications platforms that you've got to monitor all the time. You got to monitor
mm,
your Blue Sky now. You've got your email. You've got Slack with your editors. You've got, all these things are coming at you on your phone, and it's like 1,000 balls at your face. And, by the end, I mean, my editors made clear that I needed to respond to them within about 90 seconds when they reached out to me.
mm.
You cannot have a conversation with someone if you're looking at your phone every, 15 to 20 seconds. It's just,
Wow.
it's,
And never mind the fight or flight response that puts you in on a permanent basis.
no,
Not a lot of creativity and deep thinking can happen if you're in fight or flight.
no, I mean, the writing standards have dropped off the cliff because you simply cannot write in any kind of high quality way if you're constantly checking your feeds.
Mm,
And so and look, I am incredibly sympathetic to my former colleagues who are still getting it done. I think in many cases they are doing really heroic work, but I also think that they fail to see just how much the system is failing them and how much the system is making it impossible for them to do what they think are their jobs. Like,
mm,
when we start talking about the book again, this book is obviously its first and primary target is Johnson&Johnson, but the secondary target is really the American professional class, the doctors, the lawyers, the academics who allowed Johnson&Johnson to really get away with these outrageous acts that they did. And, you know, journalists are not immune to that stuff, but it goes to, I think, part of why people are so distrustful of, professionals and what they're supposed to believe and all that, because, healthcare is arguably the most important industry that people have dealings with.
mm,
And what I tried to show in this book about Johnson&Johnson is how often and how regularly the people you trust are actually selling you out.
mm. It's actually horrifying. It's as exciting as it is horrifying as a book. Like
Well,
I,
thank you. Well, there's a
you
huge
can pop that on the cover of the second edition.
Well, there is actually a really interesting Australian component in the book, and I don't know if you got to it. It's in the vaginal mesh section, and it was
Yes.
really Australia that really found out long before the rest of the world just how bad vaginal mesh was. And as you probably know, vaginal mesh became a national scandal in Australia in a way that it was not in any other country. And it's because you guys, almost uniquely, the Brits also have it, but you have this fabulous medical device registry that allows you to see when medical devices are going south. before anybody else. So in both the vaginal mesh and in the metal on metal hip implant situation, Australia withdrew both of those dangerous products long before the Americans did. And
Mm,
part of that has to do with just how much FDA has become a creature of industry. But a lot of it is also that, Australia actually tracks these things in a way few other countries do.
we are good at tracking and we are very good at a takedown. We don't mind taking down a big guy, no problems at all.
That,
Um,
yeah, it's that
and
context past of yours.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. You can't get quite as much past us as you can in
Right.
America, which is a good thing.
Born. You guys
Uh,
were born that
yeah,
way.
yeah, yeah, we were. And so okay, let's start unpacking this Johnson and Johnson thing because take me back to 2004 when you have an encounter with a Johnson and Johnson rep. Was that encounter? Were you kind of going to speak to this person, or was it by chance?
I adore March Madness, and this was now 20 years ago, and there was a March Madness game on. I had a couple of hours. I wanted to watch it, and I sat down to do so.
Okay, and so how do we go from the chance sitting down to do so and who you were actually sitting next to becoming one of the reasons you started going down pharmaceutical industry rabbit holes?
So she was rooting for Mississippi State, which was this um, at the time one of the favorites in the tournament.
Mm,
Uh, and they were playing what was at the time the sort of the Cinderella team of the tournament. And when I sat down, it was just the end of the half, and Mississippi State, I think, was up by like 20 points. I mean, it was clear that Mississippi State was going to win this game. And then over the course of the next 20 minutes of basketball, which of course takes place over nearly an hour and a half, Mississippi State collapsed and lost. And this woman with this Mississippi State baseball cap on was crushed. And I sort of made fun of her a little bit because, it was how could they possibly lose this game? And we ended up talking, and it turned out that she was a drug sales rep for Johnson&Johnson. And I, of course, immediately told her, well, I'm a drug reporter for the New York Times. And
mm.
she nearly fled right then. And but we ended up talking, and as I say in the book, she told me a story about her family, and how it intersected with her professional responsibilities in a terrible way that ended up kind of leading to me pursuing that one story that then,
Mm.
metastasized into a whole group of stories and then eventually into this book.
Wow. And was she key in helping with further questions after that meeting?
No, she did
No.
not get my card. I mean, I wanted, to talk to her again. I gave her my card. She left my card on the bar. She, waved goodbye to me as Mr. New York Times, and I never saw or heard from her again.
Mm,
Um, I would subsequently get to know a lot of Johnson&Johnson executives. In fact, I ended up getting a lot of grand jury documents. In these grand jury documents are thousands of employee names and cell phone numbers. So over the course of writing this book, I called and interviewed hundreds of them, in a way that I'm sure drove Johnson&Johnson corporate headquarters nuts because, roughly 9 out of 10 of these people didn't know me, hung up on me, and I'm sure immediately reported the exchange to corporate. But I got, you know, 10% of people to talk to me. And when you're calling hundreds and hundreds of people, 10% adds up.
that does add up. And how much do you get from the real person in that conversation compared to the court records and what's happening in courtrooms? How much more do you get?
Oddly, not a lot more.
I was going to say, I wouldn't imagine it would be a ton of extra juicy information given
Right. So
given who they
th-
work for.
this book took me 6 years.
Mm,
If I had to do it over again, I probably wouldn't reach out to all those hundreds of people because the juice probably wasn't worth the squeeze. Now, the fact that I did, I think, lends enormous credibility to this book. And I obviously have a bunch of quotes of some of these both executives and lower down people that add, I think, enormous amount of credibility to the book. But those quotes took me so much work and so much effort.
mm.
The book was originally twice as long when I
I can
sub-
imagine. I'm impressed with how you managed to kind of squeeze that down because
I
there's a lot
didn't.
in there.
I didn't actually. We had editors to do
Ah,
that. And
nice.
and so I had a lot more remarks from these and Johnson&Johnson employees in the original manuscript because I couldn't stand not to have them. I'd worked so hard to get them. And, to my great disappointment, but I agreed with their decisions. My editors were like, Gardner, we can't have all this. We have to get rid of a lot of this. And
Mm,
so the book is, even so, it's a long book, and is, very meaty. But it doesn't have nearly the kind of detail, the sort of the personal executives details and patient details. I also went through months and months and months to try to find specific patients impacted by these things.
mm.
And
And did you find anyone who used to work for Johnson and kind of abdicated, basically, like either whistleblowers or crisis of conscience?
sure, absolutely, and they're
Mm,
quoted in the book. Um, Yeah, and it's sort of a self-selected sample that way. The
mm,
people who were most likely to talk to me were the ones who had really had a crisis of conscience, either at the time or subsequently. Having said that, it was remarkable the share of people who, in many of these instances, did not know that Johnson&Johnson had pleaded guilty to criminal charges about the very things that they had done.
mm,
Like it just well, Johnson&Johnson is unbelievably skilled at gaslighting their own employees. They have this intensive internal acculturation and training for their employees around the credo. They call it the credo. Anybody else would call it a credo.
mm,
And around the 1982 Tylenol poisoning scandal. Both are deeply problematic in ways that people within Johnson&Johnson don't understand. But it creates this idea in most Johnson&Johnson employees that their employer is uniquely ethical. And so I think what it did was provide a kind of permission structure for what otherwise they would have seen as so obviously wildly unethical and even illegal behavior.
mm. I remember when I started writing about Monsanto and genetically modified seeds and things just on Facebook, uncovering things and meeting Vandana Shiva and finding out there's like a team of people who literally are employed to take her down on the internet, and that's what they do.
Right.
And I remember the kinds of comments I would get. It was so obviously from Monsanto employees who genuinely believed they were under some sort of a duty to feed the world. Genuinely believed it. You could
Oh, yeah.
feel it. I'm a good
Well,
reader of people, and I could see that they weren't just trolls. They were desperately trying to make a case for what they were doing. And I found that really fascinating. And that indoctrination in a corporate structure can be really hard to see the wood from the trees if you're
yeah.
in there.
Oh, yeah. I covered Monsanto. I have family members who actually worked at Monsanto and close friends it's hard to remember that back in the day, Monsanto was seen as really one of the good guys because, of course,
Mm,
the whole point, and as you know, I was the South Asia correspondent for the New York Times. I covered Bangladesh. Bangladesh would not survive if not for genetically modified seeds of rice crops that allow them to grow in a highly salinated environment, right? Which is
mm,
what's happening with climate change is that Bangladesh is gradually being flooded by the Bay of Bengal, and so seawater is coming into all of these agriculture environments, and they're able to still grow rice in these environments because they have these really hardy seeds that grow in the presence of salt. So, like, it was that kind of idea that
mm.
really animated Monsanto in the early days. What Monsanto ended up using those skills for were not to feed the world, but rather to feed them Roundup, their herbicide.
Mm.
Right? So their big sellers are crops that have been modified to handle
More pesticide and
infinite
herbicide.
amount
Yeah.
of pesticides and herbicides. So so they ended up doing just the opposite of what they kind of said they were going to do and what they recruited so many people to do in their careers,
Mm,
like come here and we will save the planet. Just meanwhile, let's work on Roundup ready crops. And the subsequent good stuff never really happened. And
yeah.
and that's really that's how companies gaslight huge numbers of people to do incredibly unethical things because they have a great story. Johnson&Johnson, if you go to Harvard Business School, you go to the Wharton School, the very first case study that you will study is how Johnson&Johnson how its reaction to the 1982 Tylenol poisoning scare was the model of corporate crisis response. Now, it just so happens that that's completely wrong. And as you know, I tell the story of the
Mm,
1982 Tylenol poisoning scandal, where it's clear that Johnson&Johnson's behavior was far from ideal. And the real lessons from the 1982 Tylenol poisoning scandal is that if you pay off the regulators, if you're actually paying illegally the FDA commissioner, if you are undermining all reporters, you can get your BS story believed by, you know, nearly all reporters and the American public. I mean, it's
mm,
much the lesson that is taught in Harvard and Wharton and every other school is if you're open and you're honest and you really kind of do the right thing from the get-go, the public will reward you. That's not the real lesson. The real lesson is that you can fool almost everybody all the time.
hmm That's why it ends up in artist song lyrics, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Okay, so I want to talk about the opioid crisis because Johnson and Johnson played a huge part in marketing the marvel of their drug. I'm just trying to remember, Duragesic, is that it?
Good for
Yep.
you. Yep.
Yep. Which is basically it's fentanyl. And we know
Which
we
is the
have,
Johnson& Johnson discovered medicine, by the way.
yes, and we have a huge problem with this. So, how did they manage to get such a toxic, addictive drug to be in every corner of every home in America and much of the world now? It's crazy.
Well, so of course, there's two parts to the Johnson& Johnson story in opioids. One
Yeah.
part, of course, involves Australia and Tasmanian alkaloids,
Mm,
and how Johnson& Johnson bought in the 1970s this opioid production facility on the island of Tasmania and turned it into this blockbuster producer that produced two-thirds of all the natural opioids used in the United States. So all of Purdue Pharma's opioid production for OxyContin and all of their hydrocodone pills came from Johnson& Johnson. Johnson& Johnson was by far and away their most important supplier. So there's a story there, and Johnson&Johnson itself had all of these semi-synthetic and natural opioids that it sold and it branded to compete and to work alongside OxyContin. So
And
there's
can I just, you say natural and synthetic. I just don't
right,
want to leave anyone out who's going, what does that mean?
right,
So, does this mean they've made it just synthetic enough, kind of like a Monsanto
right.
situation, that they can then patent it and privatize it?
Exactly. So
Mm,
semi-synthetic opioids are these the yes, they you sort of create a new molecule, but it really comes the primary source is a natural product.
mm,
So, in Tasmania, so there are two basic ways to make opioids, right? You first you have all these opium poppies, and one way is the traditional way, which is still done in Turkey, still done obviously in Afghanistan and elsewhere, in which you grow these poppies and then you go by hand to the flower bulbs and you slice the side of the bulb. And opium poppies are that have this extraordinary latex that it heals its own wound. So this latex will come out on the slice and it'll be this brown almost band-aid on the poppy bulb. And then workers then go back several days later and then scrape off that brown pus, it looks like, and it's a
mm,
latex. And that brown stuff is essentially opium. That's
mm.
what you use. And back in the day when Chinese were addicted and all this sort of stuff, mostly because the Brits addicted them so that they could then buy Chinese tea, right? So the great opium war.
The Brits do love their
Yeah.
tea.
So the only way the Chinese emperor at the time wouldn't allow the Brits to trade in anything but gold, and
Mm,
so essentially the only way the East India Company could sort of get this done is by bringing in opium, selling it for gold, and then taking away tea. Anyway,
mm,
that's the original opium thing. What you uniquely did in Australia and in Tasmania is that you realized that you didn't actually need that much manual labor. That if you grew up the poppies and then harvested the entire flower and stem, you could then process it and get the ingredients that you needed for opioids out of the entire flower. It's not as concentrated, but you actually Johnson&Johnson bought this condensed milk plant there, and then the condensation process they used to actually sort of boil down the opioids. And then Johnson&Johnson did this sort of genetic process to get a flower that they called the Norman flower that produced an extraordinary amount of one particular alkaloid that is particularly good for hydrocodone, that is
mm,
OxyContin. Anyway, that's the natural part. This entirely synthetic part is that back in 1960, Johnson bought this Belgium company called Janssen Pharmaceutica, and Paul Janssen is one of the greatest medicinal chemists in history, and he's the guy who discovered, right as Johnson&Johnson was buying his company, fentanyl. And fentanyl, as we all know, is 75 times more powerful
mm,
morphine, which is, the traditional opioid, and is wildly addictive. And Johnson&Johnson created a Band-Aid with fentanyl in it. So it's a patch. And the idea was to provide painkiller for 72 hours for people essentially um, who you were about to read their last rites. I mean,
mm,
it was for either very brief use or last rites.
mm,
It was for, mostly cancer pain. But OxyContin comes out and shows to Johnson&Johnson, wow, you can make serious money in this market if you go beyond the indication that the FDA has given you. And what really was going on at this time, Alex, is that the pharmaceutical industry actually their labs were failing. The great period of medicinal chemistry kind of began with aspirin in the late 1800s and then ended with this flurry of amazing drugs like the statins, like Lipitor and
Mm,
Zocor, and the the stomach acid drugs like Tagamet and Prilosec and all those drugs, like a huge number of drugs that were all created through medicinal chemistry and all came out in really in the 80s and the 90s and made the pharmaceutical industry what it is today, these gigantic, highly profitable companies. But suddenly in the mid 1990s, all of their labs go dry. And so what they are forced to do is either they're going to have to accept lower profits, which nobody's going to accept. Or
Well,
they're
and they kind of can't, right?
right,
You actually, like, you are literally in a system that needs growth always, because otherwise shareholders get upset, board members get upset, your company tanks. Like, for me, I keep going back to why did we listen to GDP theory as like some kind of blueprint for success? Because
right,
you end up with a too big to fail.
right. So all these companies have fewer drugs that they're launching. There's now a generic industry, which in the United States starts in 1984. And the generic industry started because Congress passed a law that said, if there's a drug that's already on the market and the patents have expired, you don't have to test it in people, which is really expensive. You just have to do some chemical tests to show that it's chemically identical to
Mm,
drug that we already approved and was tested in people. And so the generic drug industry comes up and they start, prior to the generic drug industry in 1984, the biggest selling drug was Valium in 1984. And it had been on the market for 30 years. And, it just had this great brand name. It was called Mother's Little Helper, sort of a, and it just was gonna have these big sales in perpetuity. Well, now you can have pharmacists prescribe instead of brand name Valium, you can have them prescribe generic Valium.
mm,
So like all of these, Valium was sold by Roche at the time, and Roche over, 7 or 8 years suddenly sees this enormous franchise they'd spent decades building collapse. And that
mm,
put these companies on this innovation treadmill. And
yeah.
now you only have 20 years to sell a drug. That's the time of your patents. Now, companies have done a lot of things to extend that lifeline. They've patent estates and all that. I won't go into it. But basically, at some point this drug is going to have generic competitors. So you need a new one, and then you need the next new one, and then you need the next new one. And the problem was in the mid 1990s, these companies suddenly their labs run dry. They don't have any new ones. And so they respond basically by the largest bout of criminality in American industrial history. Maybe you could compare it to, the time in the 1920s and 30s when so many companies were selling alcohol, against the law. But
Mm,
but companies during this period of time, there has been something like 350 criminal guilty pleas that collectively the fines have been in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Like there has never been that much frank criminality in a top industry in American history. And why? Because they just don't have enough new products. So what they have to do is start selling their old products to patients for whom these drugs are not intended. And one
mm,
of those is Duragesic. Here's a patch, opioid patch or fentanyl patch that is intended only for dying cancer patients. And Johnson&Johnson, seeing how well, Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers are selling OxyContin to everyone and their brother, decides to do the same thing with Duragesic. And the amazing thing is that their marketing campaign for Duragesic, which remember is fentanyl, one of the most
mm,
addictive, dangerous substance ever discovered. And they market fentanyl as a non-addictive alternative to OxyContin. Like,
And how do they do that? In Australia, you would never get away with that.
right.
I
Yeah,
remember in cosmetics, we weren't even allowed to use the word wrinkles, and we'd have these huddle groups to try and figure out, like, how can we get the anti-aging message across when I was like 21 in marketing. And I thought, that always stayed with me when I learned about our TGA regulatory body and how tough they are on messaging with even natural products, drugs, whatever it is. Very, very tough. How on earth in America did they get away with that?
because they quietly took over the FDA.
Mm.
In the late 1980s and 1990s, the FDA, Congress, remember this is the era of Newt Gingrich. I don't know if you're, oh,
Oh, yes, Newt Gingrich was the guy who really patented the idea that if you cross the aisle, you are done. You get
right.
primaried, you're out of the party for the Republicans, right?
Right. And it was and it was the beginning, and we're seeing this now with the Trump administration of slashing government. And
Mm,
so the Republicans really slashed the budget of the FDA. And what what happened is that FDA, because it just didn't have the money, ended up taking the average was more than 2 years to approve new medicines because they just didn't have the personnel to go through these huge files on all the studies being done on these new medicines. And so there was something called the drug lag, which was the United States started getting these new drugs much later than Europe, where the EMEA, the FDA equivalent, was much more rapid. They had more staffing. And so David Kessler, who was the commissioner of the FDA at the time, realized that he had to do something because the drug lag was becoming so controversial that Republicans in Congress were actually talking of taking away the drug approval process from the FDA, which is kind of their core function, and getting private companies to do these on sort of a contract basis. So what Kessler did was strike an agreement with the drug industry, which is you pay us fees and we'll be able to hire more people to review your products faster. And why that was so important is because of the arrival of the generic drug industry, the drug industry realized that every month that they lost in an FDA review process was a month of sales they could never get back. Like
mm,
if you have a drug that's selling $5 billion annually, 1 month of sales is more than $500 million. I mean,
mm.
it's a lot of money. And so they suddenly realize if they pay the FDA these fees, they will get these drugs quicker. They will get it on the market sooner, and their total sales for those drugs will be vastly increased. The
Pay
problem
the FDA fees. What could possibly go wrong?
Exactly. So what happens is basically an industry takeover of the FDA.
Mm,
And each one of these fees agreements were only 5 years long. And so at the end of every 5 year period, the industry would go back and say, okay, we'll agree to these fees again, but you have to essentially sell another part of the agency to us. You have to stop cracking down when we violate the law. You have to stop coming after us. You have to partner with us. So now, top FDA officials, when they go speak, they nearly always refer to industry as their customers, as their partners.
mm.
FDA officials never talk about the public as their customers and their partners. It's industry. FDA is now very much a simply partner to industry. So how did they get away with this? Because the FDA never cracked down on them. All of the stories that I'm telling you in this book, and almost every guilty plea that has come out of the industry, these 350 criminal guilty pleas, were the result of inside whistleblowers going to prosecutors and telling prosecutors, independent of the FDA, what was going on, and prosecutors then pursuing these companies. There is not a single one of these cases after 1992, when FDA started taking money from the drug industry, in which the FDA, even though it has criminal investigators, has guys with guns inside, the FDA never let those guys with guns basically out of the box again.
Hmm.
So that's how they got away with it.
And what year was that was beginning?
1992.
Mm-hmm.
So the
Wow.
opioid crisis really doesn't explode into view until, the approval of OxyContin in 1996.
Mm.
Analgesic is actually approved in 1992. So basically, I make an argument in my book that the opioid crisis would never have happened if David Kessler hadn't essentially sold the FDA to the drug industry, this thing that has killed more than 500,000 Americans. And of course,
Mm.
the antipsychotic crisis that I talk about would never, millions of Americans have died. There's
Mm.
simply no doubt about this. There is no argument. Millions of Americans have died from these myriad criminal schemes, largely because Congress refused to fund the FDA.
Wow. So what I'm hearing there is that like the stripping of public service jobs was actually in part one of the reasons we ended up with an opioid crisis.
Oh, it is the main reason.
The main reason.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, because the FDA actually, this beleaguered office within the FDA, which oversaw marketing efforts.
Mm.
And oftentimes, there was like one little guy in there,
Yeah, yeah.
responsibility for thousands, looking at thousands and thousands of these ads. But these, nonetheless, they sent out these warning letters to Johnson&Johnson again and again and again and again, saying, you can't describe fentanyl as non-addicting. Like, that's not
Mm.
possible. That is so crazy. You've got to stop. And
But that
Johnson,
sounds like a friendly friend kind of saying, come on, mate.
right,
It
exactly.
doesn't sound particularly threatening.
Right. And
Um,
Johnson&Johnson, which spends more on lawyers than any company in the world, right? They've spent more than $25 billion on litigation expenses over the last 10 years alone. They would, fire up their lawyers who would send letters to the FDA in response, this FDA, marketing division saying, we're not sure what you're talking about. Can you explain some more? And so there would be this jaw-boning back and forth of letters. And meanwhile, the advertisements or the marketing campaign
they're
would go
still running. It's
on
innocent
more.
until proven guilty out there.
And then finally, they might say, okay, well, we now understand what you're saying. We're withdrawing that. And they're withdrawing it, of course, because they've now got a new set of
Oh
ads.
my gosh. It's
And,
like a basketballer kind of hugging the
right.
ball when there's 10 seconds left on the clock and it's a close game. It's like, how fine a line can I tread before I get a penalty?
Right. And in none of these cases did Johnson&Johnson ever get a penalty. They would simply, do the rope-a-dope with this office. And because the agency was now run by people who saw Johnson&Johnson as one of their most important partners, these problems were never stepped up to a criminal investigation. One of the stories I tell Alex in the book is in 2012, one of these fee negotiations between FDA and the industry was going on in medical devices. So each part of the FDA, the drug center, negotiates directly with the pharmaceutical industry for its money. The medical device center negotiates directly with the medical device industry. Anyway, this negotiation was going on, and the device committee had been taken over by these small companies in 2012 who basically told FDA to shove itself. Like, we're not paying you jack anymore. And so FDA was in a panic. And the commissioner of the FDA then called up Alex Gorski, who was then the head of the medical device part of Johnson&Johnson, who would soon become their CEO, and
Mm.
said, save us. The industry, if we don't have a deal, I'm going to have to lay off hundreds of reviewers in the medical device division, and you're not going to get your devices approved. and the public will suffer. Well, Alex Gorski rode to the rescue, ended up putting together a deal between the industry and FDA, and used Johnson&Johnson's huge number of lobbyists on Capitol Hill, got it sold in Congress, and literally rescued the FDA's medical device division. And FDA paid Johnson&Johnson back. And this is why it's so important to look at products across a major company like Johnson&Johnson, because you
Yeah.
can't really see these trends unless you look at a whole bunch of products. But what FDA did in response is that they delayed the recall of those dangerous vaginal meshes that you guys in Australia had already taken off the market. They delayed the recall of those dangerous metal on metal hip implants that you guys in Australia had already taken off the market. When they did, essentially do things to lower the sales of these. They didn't do a recall. They just asked Johnson&Johnson essentially to stop selling them, which meant when you do a recall, your liability soars. And
Mm.
plaintiffs' attorneys win huge amounts of money because a recall is an admission that something is
Yeah.
unsafe. When you simply start selling it, you say, oh, well, we stopped selling it not because it's unsafe, but because, it's just the marketing wasn't working. And
Mm.
so FDA did that. FDA then sends out a letter just before Johnson&Johnson has this opioid trial in Oklahoma, and FDA 2 weeks before sends out this letter that is tailor-made for J&J's defense, saying opioids are incredibly important products. Just before a big trial involving Risperdal in kids, FDA
Mm.
puts out a statement that is tailor-made to help J&J's defense in that case. And in the baby powder trials, we haven't talked about Johnson's baby powder.
No, well, that was one of the things that made a lot of mainstream people who hadn't had any of these issues
Right,
with particular drugs or hip replacements go, what? The baby
right,
brand is like toxic? A
right.
lot of people woke up to Johnson&Johnson at that point.
It is, I mean, it is, I believe, and there's some top people who have said this to me in background conversations. It is the greatest consumer fraud in American history. You know,
Mm.
Johnson and Johnson for decades sold a powder for babies that it knew was contaminated with asbestos. It knew.
It's
I mean,
crazy. I mean, I spent the first 4 years of my life in Chicago and in the mid 70s. So I was like lathered up in Johnson&Johnson products. I remember, I could tell you, if you put that smell in front of me with my eyes closed, I could tell you exactly what it is. And I haven't smelt it in 45 years.
so that smell, Johnson and Johnson did surveys that showed that that smell is the most recognized smell in the world. And Johnson's baby powder is arguably the most powerful branding instrument ever created, right? Because when babies first smell that product, it comes with this moment where their mother is, wiping their butt of shit, right?
Mm.
It's like the best moment
Let's
as a
make it pleasant. Yeah.
the best moment as a baby, which is that this stuff is being cleared away from me. It's being done by the most important person, on the planet. And she is cooing at me and loving me all the while. And thus, this smell gets associated with the best possible thing that happens to you in your young life. So
Mm.
this branding tool, it's this brainworm of unrivaled power that so nearly, half of Americans had their bottoms powdered with Johnson's baby powder. And thus, when they smell that smell as adults, and as you know, the smell, the olfactory center in your brain is right by the emotional core of your brain. So
Mm.
that's why smells can elicit such an extraordinary emotional response because those two parts of your brain are right side by side. And
Mm.
so what happens is that you smell that smell and you have this sense of trust and love that wells up inside of you. And for decades, Johnson&Johnson executives, when they gave speeches, they would start their speeches by saying, when I say Johnson's baby powder, how many people can just smell it? And the entire room would light up because everyone's face would smile like, as if they'd been hypnotized.
Mm.
So that shield of Johnson's baby powder ended up protecting Johnson&Johnson from criminal guilty plea after criminal guilty plea after criminal guilty plea of extraordinarily bad behavior. And when I wrote these stories showing like that it had done terrible things that it knew would kill babies, people would say to me, "Oh, Gardner, well, okay, they might have messed up on this one case, but Johnson&Johnson is a great company." And I'd always be like, "Why do you think that?"
Mm. And so basically, we're like a giant mass of abuse victim who refuses to believe things are going to change, or refuses to believe that like things can't change. And our fantasy of this being a lovely, lovely brand
Yeah,
that looks after our precious babies and helps our mothers.
right.
Yeah,
And
wow.
for many women in the United States who bore children in the U.S., one of the big gifts that they used to get is this, mommy's mother's basket of
Oh,
that.
it's here. It's not
Oh,
just America. Yeah.
right, right,
Yeah.
around the world. And
Hmm.
you got the Johnson's baby, you got this little thing of Johnson's baby powder, baby oil, shampoo, and for many mothers, it was this, it well, it had this extraordinary reminder of arguably the most important moment in their lives when they
Mm.
took their child home from the hospital and were given what to them seemed like, the most trusted products on the planet to help care for this, infant that for many women, of course, scared the bejesus out of them, right? Like,
Yeah.
I
But
do
then
it.
you had this generous care package and it was comforting. Yeah.
So again, a brilliant marketing and branding tool, and it's why Johnson&Johnson has sold itself since 1918 as the baby company
Mm.
because and all these internal documents show this. They know that those baby products are even though the actual profit from those products are relatively low, they are the most valuable products in the company because they basically shield all of their bad behavior from anyone really believing it.
Mm. And speaking of really believing it, like, can we talk about anemic cancer patients? Because that was a
Sure.
horrifying story with the drug that was supposed to help their anemia, but it turns out grew tumors.
Right.
Hello?
Yeah. So this is another one of those stories that shows, at least from the American perspective, um, just how corrupt the entire system is.
Mm.
Because basically every oncologist in the country, and certainly every cancer hospital in the country, was in on the scam. And this is what the grand jury documents that I have show. Just one note about grand juries, like in the United States, and believe this is also true in Australia, grand juries are the last truly secret institutions. I don't think the New York Times has had any insight into a single grand jury since the Clinton Starr grand jury in the 1990s. Like, and not the Wall Street Journal. Like, grand juries are secret. When the Mueller grand jury was investigating Trump and Russia, I was, a, a Washington correspondent, a White House correspondent. We knew nothing about what was going on. Like, grand juries, like you get all kinds of national security secrets when you're in those jobs. Reporters never get grand jury documents. That's why it's so extraordinary that I have hundreds of them from
How did you get them?
right from multiple different grand juries. And what the Procrit, what the EPO grand jury, and again, we're talking about EPO here. Lots of people know EPO through Lance Armstrong, right, and bicycling. And Lance Armstrong and a lot of cyclists on the Tour de France used EPO to boost their red blood cell count, which allowed them to process oxygen much more efficiently, which, as you know, in cycling is so important and for all aerobic exercise. So people know EPO through the sports doping world, but
Hmm.
actually the biggest use of EPO by far for many, many, many years was in cancer because what Johnson and Johnson struck a deal with Amgen that was the first creator of EPO. Originally, EPO was intended just for kidney dialysis because what happens in kidney dialysis, as you know, your kidneys stop functioning, your kidneys filter your blood of toxins. So what happens in dialysis is you have these filtration systems outside of your body that you then cycle your entire blood through these filtration systems to get out the toxins that your kidneys would normally do. But human filtration systems aren't nearly as good as the usual kidneys, and they end up destroying. Dialysis destroys a lot of red blood cells, and
Mm.
so dialysis patients become anemic. When you're anemic, it's when you have fewer red blood cells, right? Which are the things that transport oxygen around your body and are so important for that case. So Amgen realizes that one way to correct anemia is to get this EPO, erythropoietin, which is the little stimulant that your bone marrow needs to create red blood cells. And so what EPO does is it's a signal to your bone marrow. We need to create more red blood cells. And the thinking was if you gave dialysis patients this EPO, they would create their own red blood cells. They wouldn't be as anemic and they wouldn't need blood transfusions, which was the cure for really acute life-threatening anemia at the time. It's a great idea. And then Johnson&Johnson was like, well, cancer patients get anemic because chemotherapy often destroys red blood cells as well. Why don't we sell it to cancer patients? So EPO became this kind of all-encompassing pick-me-up for anybody who was kind of sick. Cancer patients, dialysis patients, just give them a shot of EPO and they're going to feel better because they'll have more red blood cells and they'll have this great pick-me-up. The problem is that Johnson&Johnson knew from day one that EPO also was miracle grow to cancer and tumors. At the time, there was this whole research program called anti-angiogenesis, which grew out of this discovery that the way tumors grow in your body is that they send out signaling, EPO often, to say, I need more red blood cells. And your body actually builds capillaries around tumors to feed the tumors and make them grow. So EPO itself is miracle grow to tumors is a tumor fertilizer. And even though Johnson&Johnson had decided to start selling EPO to cancer patients, they secretly started a research program internally to develop an anti-EPO drug, a drug that killed off EPO, which they thought would actually kill off tumors as well. So here they are selling EPO to cancer patients and telling them it'll be a great pick-me-up, don't worry about it. And then internally, they're actually got this research program to basically destroy EPO because they know that that will hurt the tumors. So for 15 years, they're selling EPO. It is their biggest selling drug by far. It's the first great biotechnology franchise in history. And and it's being sold in Europe, it's being sold elsewhere. And they create this whole scheme to encourage doctors and hospitals to undertake massive insurance fraud. And basically what they do is they add extra EPO to these vials. Then they're telling the government that they're selling to these oncologists. And so they give away extra EPO to oncologists and then teach oncologists how to bill for that EPO as if they'd paid full freight.
Mm.
So oncologists in the United States start making huge amounts of money on this extra free EPO. The average oncologist in the United States during this period made $300,000 in their entire practice By selling extra EPO, they made another $300,000. They doubled their income largely through insurance fraud. And nearly every major cancer hospital was in on the scam. In fact, they were so intent on maximizing their insurance fraud that they hired what are known as compounding pharmacies to repackage the EPO so that they could capture as much of this free EPO as they possibly could so that they could charge insurers, including the federal government, as much as they could in fraudulent EPO.
So, how on earth is justice sought and found in this kind of a case? That's obscene. So many people would have been affected.
Yeah, no justice. There was no way to. It's clear that EPO got epidemiologists to estimate the EPO death toll. It's around 500,000. So it's very similar to the opioid disaster death toll, the original opioid prescription disaster death toll. Um, and, and then similarly, the antipsychotic death toll is more than 1 million, probably.
Mm.
In fact, quietly, one person estimated 6 million of the antipsychotic death toll. I took the much more conservative figure that has actually been published publicly. And in each one of these cases, it's impossible for anybody to get justice because in the EPO case, what happened is that people who had cancer died sooner of cancer or died of cancer instead of being cured of it. And there was no way to distinguish those who would have lived or who would have lived longer. And, it's worthwhile noting that most cancer drugs only give you a few months extra life, right?
Mm.
Very few drugs actually cure you of cancer. So the fact that EPO sped your death is a huge deal because almost the entire point of going to see a doctor when you have cancer is to slow your death and delay your death. And this EPO was by far the most popular drug in cancer in the United States during this period of time. And in fact, it was the single largest expense of the federal government in the United States. So,
What?
yeah, we spent more on EPO than we did on aircraft carriers, anything, for about 15 years. And all because Johnson&Johnson lied so thoroughly and so effectively
And
about.
about something that you couldn't prove
Right.
was down to the drug because of the disease it was the type of person it was supporting.
Same thing in antipsychotics. Like
Yeah.
it tended to kill people through heart attacks, strokes, and as we said, um, uh, you know, antipsychotics, one way it kills you is by making you far more susceptible to respiratory infection. And, Johnson&Johnson's criminal scheme meant that nursing home patients were being given this drug in huge amounts when they should not have been. And this is, and American nursing home patients to this day get far more antipsychotics than nursing home patients almost anywhere else on the planet. Why did American nursing homes suffer such huge mortality during the first initial COVID-19 wave? Well, again, uh, Johnson&Johnson's drug kills you by making you more susceptible to respiratory infection. COVID-19 is a respiratory infection. So justice basically in nearly all of these cases is all but impossible.
But isn't Justice a company like Johnson&Johnson like dying out, like just actually going down?
So Johnson&Johnson has been sued by hundreds of thousands of people in
Yeah.
the vaginal mesh case, in the metal on metal hip implants case. Now they're facing 93,000 lawsuits in the baby powder litigation. But it nonetheless is genius at making sure that these cases never really see the inside of courtrooms. They're right now using this extraordinary procedure in the baby powder cases to to put all of their baby powder liabilities into this small little company called Red River, and then declaring bankrupt that company, and then forcing all of the people who are suing over baby powder to, get the leavings from the bankruptcy case. Johnson
Jesus.
and
Wow.
and just they've said that they're going to have this $10 billion trust, but there have been previous cases where Johnson&Johnson has put together just such a trust. For instance, in the Propulsid case, the lawyers all got their money, all got paid. There was this trust set aside to pay patients, but there was this extraordinarily high bar for patients to qualify for any money. In the Propulsid case, not one single patient ended up qualifying for the money. So the money that was set aside in this trust eventually, years later, with no public notice, went right back to Johnson and Johnson. So what happens in a lot of these cases is that the lawyers who represent these people are actually in on the fix. And the patients, who are the claimants and the plaintiffs, get nothing.
So your doctor who's supposed to help you stay healthy, get healthy, cure, whatever, is a part of it
Yep,
sometimes. I
getting
will
paid
say
on,
not everybody, sometimes.
and a
The
huge,
lawyers sometimes are
yep.
also in on it. And so, I mean, I'm going to leave people to read the book because it's truly incredible. But I want to spend a few minutes before we wrap up on how the heck do we rebuild trust in science? Because it seems like pre 1992, 95, that was actually a pretty decent framework. There were a lot less medical deaths, at least, anyway.
Alex, I mean, I get a little lost myself. I mean, I
Mm,
cannot say that Trump and his acolytes are completely wrong to kind of knock it down, and maybe we need to build it back up again in a very different way. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to skin this cat.
mm,
Make a whole host of recommendations at the end of the book, about how to tackle this, certainly in the medical sector. I personally think that doctors should not be allowed to take gifts of money, food, or anything of value from companies, drug makers, all the rest, and treat people as, in the federal Medicare program and elsewhere. Like, if you want to go work for industry, and this has been true for reporters for a long time, I mean, there's nothing wrong with going work for industry. You just can't be a reporter at the same time. And the same thing is true, it should be true for doctors, academics, and in some cases, lawyers. You're welcome to go help out Johnson and Johnson if you want to. You're welcome to take money from Johnson and Johnson if you want to. You just can't treat patients while you're doing that. And there
mm,
should be some 2 year kind of period in which a washout period in which, if you take those sorts of monies, you cannot make these supposedly independent decisions, because the reason we trust doctors, the reason they are there, is that they are supposed to be what is known as a learned intermediary. And an
mm,
intermediary is someone who is supposed to be independent of all of these other influences in the healthcare system. You don't want your doctor to be corrupted by,
mm,
you know, pe- by the providers of drugs and devices that they then have to make a choice for. In medical devices, for instance, in the United States, for decades, and all medical device companies pleaded guilty to bribing surgeons, like every single one. So every surgeon who did hip implants, every surgeon who did knee implants, all of them for years, these orthopedists were bribed to the tune of, many of them, millions of dollars to
and is
choose.
this uniquely America, or were you seeing this in other parts of the world as well?
So it's not unique to the United States, although it is a big part of the American experience. You do not have it in Australia. You have
Mm,
government-run system. You have this independent technology assessment group that's very good, that is making the decision about what implants and what drugs should be used in your system. So there are systems out there that have real buffers between doctors' commercial incentives and the practice of medicine. The Americans don't, and the problem is that we are so corrupt that you get an enormous amount of messaging from us that you end up absorbing.
Yeah, we
So
do.
the use of EPO, for instance, you used a third as much EPO in cancer patients during this period of time as American doctors did. American doctors used 3 times as much EPO in cancer patients as you. So, and that's because you didn't have all the financial incentives and you didn't have all the nonsense, marketing that we got here. So you are somewhat insulated, but not entirely. But
Mm.
what really needs to happen is there needs to be just real, like it is in Britain and Australia, much more separation between the commercial interests on the one hand and the people who are making decisions about your life and death and healthcare on the other.
Yeah. And then that brings me back to dissolving Citizens United. Like, that's got to be one of the biggest failures that sent us on this train wreck of private industry hold on government decision and rollout, right? And research.
So, Citizens United was fundamentally this core decision from the Republican part of the Supreme Court saying that corporations had free speech rights, that they, in having free speech rights, you cannot limit their donations to politicians, right? And we see this dynamic in healthcare in a huge way because one of the reasons why Johnson&Johnson was so defensive and refused to plead guilty to criminal charges around its marketing, its false and misleading marketing around all of these products, is that they basically said, we're a corporation, we have free speech rights. It
Mm.
doesn't matter what FDA approved these products for. We can tell doctors to use them however we want them used in whatever patients we want them used. So your question really goes to the core thing going on in healthcare, which is, can corporations lie to you? Are they free? Do they have the right to lie to you or to tell you things that are simply untrue and bad for your health? Can they pay doctors and lie to those doctors about the same thing?
And
How,
can they pay Congress people and senators?
so, how broad is this freedom of speech for corporations? And one of the reasons why FDA is so timid and will not go after these companies, even though FDA constantly catches them lying, is that they fear that if one of these cases gets to the Supreme Court and Johnson&Johnson sues them, the Supreme Court will tell FDA, you cannot police any of the marketing messages of any of these companies because their free speech rights are unabridgable. And so it's the Citizens United case is much bigger than just about money for politicians.
Mm.
Actually has infected the entire healthcare system of the United States and completely taken FDA's will from policing this industry.
Wow, thank you for stepping that out in the broader sense. Have you ever thought about going into policy yourself? I mean, does it ever tempt you?
So I left the New York Times and I then became a consultant and I worked for the Rockefeller Foundation, ended up writing the Biden administration's COVID-19 testing plan. And I helped the Trump administration as well on COVID-19. Um, it was it was very ugly what's
Mm.
on the inside. Um,
Mm.
it would have to be just the right person for me to go in and do that again because it's a it's it's incredibly hard to get anything done and get it right. I have found it was I suspected as much when, when I
Mm.
was reporting on the White House from the outside, but once I got on the inside, it was uglier even than I thought it would be.
Wow. Well, okay. So I feel like you've actually given us some really good things that we can put to hyper localized government officials that we do have a lot more agency with as the general public. And to say, we're concerned about this. This is a broken record, a broken system, loophole central, revolving door central. I want my elected official to do something about it. Like I genuinely believe those parts of grassroots politics are better fought in town halls and with politicians than on social media, where we are getting nowhere fast.
Yeah, I think that's right. There are specific laws that can change, anytime I believe that anytime a company tests something in humans, there is an ethical must that they make public the data that they get out of this. Because when people participate in clinical trials, it it's certainly partly a hope that they get something that works for them, but many people are doing it for the good of humanity. And in
Mm,
case after case after case, Johnson&Johnson would test these dangerous products in humans and then hide the results from that came with it. And in fact, in many cases, they would then analyze the results and it would come out positive. And the FDA would analyze the same results and show that it was negative and deadly. And when you went back to the company's statisticians, they would say, well, we used a different math. Like, what? A different math?
oh
So,
my gosh.
Alex, this is why, and I know that your podcast is about urging people to do their own research.
Yeah, I don't just want like information for information's sake, right? I want like we've always got to have a thought about like, if this has lit something up in you, do something positive. Don't just bitch about the system online, because I'm sick of it and it's
Yeah.
getting us nowhere.
Well, one of the things could be, these what are known as data safety monitoring board, which are these
Mm,
researchers who analyze the results of clinical trials as they're ongoing to protect the patients in it. In my opinion, the opinions of DSMBs should always be made public. Like if
yeah.
it's a human trial, that there needs to be a DSMB and what they conclude must be made public within 6 months of their conclusions. That didn't happen in any of these cases. There are a variety of very specific things that can be done in science so that you, as a person, can actually find the real data, the real information, and not this, false front that these
Mm.
companies often put out. Right now, it's all but impossible for you to find out what's really going on. And there are ways to change the system so that you can find out.
Mm. And that in itself would mean a more of a fail fast situation. Because if people know publicly and then there's no buy in, then it's like, okay, next, next, next. And then we might actually make drugs that are safer. Imagine that. I don't think we have to choose drugs or holistic care. We're just jack of drugs having so many ridiculous side effects and being so poorly monitored and disclosed before they get
Exactly.
rolled out. That's what everyone's genuinely sick of. And I think freedom of information is actually something everyone deserves and wants, if we
Great.
really think about it.
Well, this
So,
is,
mm,
your podcast really is about a loss of trust,
mm,
in a lot of these traditional sources of information and products and drugs and all the rest. And unfortunately, what my book is about is that you have really good reason to be
we were right.
that you
Yeah.
are right.
Yeah.
And what you and I are talking about is how to fix the system, which is going to be hard. In what we're really talking about is in as many places as we possibly can, separating out decisions about people's healthcare from a profit motive and incentive.
And that's something you can take to your local politician anywhere in the world to make sure that that is happening. Gardiner, thank you so much. I mean, what an epic conversation. I feel like I could have doubled that and still been completely enthralled. I'm sure it will do very well and hopefully leads us to a better place now that everyone knows just how bad it is.
Well,
Thank you.
we'll see. I mean, I hope it gets sold in Australia. There's a lot of countries where the arm of my publisher will not publish this book because they're afraid of Johnson&Johnson.
Wow. Well,
It's,
thankfully, the internet exists, and I'm sure we'll be able to get our hands on it one way or the other.
one would hope.
Mm.
Take care, Alex.
Bye, you too.
Bye.
I hope you loved today's show as much as I loved bringing it to you. I want to remind you that if you are someone who craves a low tox community that is judgment-free, full of empowerment, has health professionals and building health professionals that can support you, as well as me in there answering questions multiple times a week, I want to invite you to join the Low Tox Club. For the price of less than a cup of coffee a month, you have an annual membership for $49 Australian, so it's about $30 US or euro, that allows you to have a member masterclass every single month with a health professional or global expert from the podcast, where we have them to ourselves for an hour to ask questions and deep dive further. You have the beautiful supportive chat group. You have Q&As with me answering questions. We read books and talk about them, and a whole bunch more. You can head to lowtoxlife.com, hit the Explore tab, and join the club is the very first option on that list. Of course, we have over 10 evergreen courses that you can jump into anytime, whether it's navigating everyday low tox swaps with our Go Low Tox signature course, whether you have kids and you're wanting to know how to best support them with our Low Tox Kids course, whether you're planning a family and looking at a healthy low tox preconception journey, reducing inflammation, especially the chronic kind, with our Inflammation Ninja course, many other courses. You can again head to lowtoxlife.com, hit the courses tab, and you'll see all of the options, which includes a business course, my Low Tox Method program. A lot of people don't know, but I was doing a lot before starting Low Tox Life in 2009, and I was a business consultant across hospitality, health, retail, and cosmetics. I have been in business consulting for a very long time, so I absolutely adore helping people move into the low tox space or develop their low tox businesses. So that's a way I can support you. And then, of course, there's our wonderful social media communities at Low Tox Life on Instagram, and of course, the website with over 250 gluten-free recipes, blogs, downloadable PDFs to help you navigate wanting to get rid of synthetic fragrances in your school or office. I could go on. So head to lowtoxlife.com, see what takes your interest or fancy, and thank you so much for being a part of our podcast community. I love reading your reviews. I appreciate every follow and subscribe, and I want to just remind you to finish off that if there's anything you heard that you found interesting from a medical or scientific perspective, it is intended as education only. Please always chat to a health professional who knows you and your situation best. I'll see you next week. Bye.